Welcome back. With the extremely cold weather experienced in Namibia and Southern Africa the past few days, the question of how our most vulnerable citizens are weathering these harsh conditions comes starkly to mind. To discuss the effects on the human body, we are joined by Dr. Nelson Makemba to give us some tips on the extreme exposure to cold, which may lead to hypothermia. Doctor, thank you for joining us. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Nina, and good evening to our viewers this evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
In layman's terms, what is hypothermia? How is it classified?
Yeah, basically when we're talking about hypothermia, it's a condition often used to describe a problem where your body loses more heat than it produces. And oftentimes, major organs such as the liver, the brain, the heart, and the muscles are the one that often produces this heat through the metabolism activities. It is often classified as either accidental hypothermia. This often happens with, for instance, a sport enthusiast who went out jogging very early in the morning or climbed uphill and was caught off guard by the element of the weather, or a traveler who has a car breakdown on the side of the road and it's a bit cold and help didn't come on time and he wasn't dressed appropriately. That kind of hypothermia become accidental. And then the primary one probably, which is the one you're going to be talking about today, is where we're looking at the less fortunate, those that are vulnerable, the low socioeconomic setting, those that are unfortunately homeless, sleeping under the bridges, or they are in corrugated structure homes where there's no proper insulation. And then obviously not forgetting our brothers and sisters who are guarding the buildings at night and they are not provided with proper infrastructure, so they are looking after this as security guards and they are standing in the evening outside the building. All of those then becomes primary. And then secondary hypothermia is a group where you might have an underlying condition such as a hypothyroid, diabetes, stroke, severe arthritis, for instance, people with spinal cord injuries. All of this, can then predispose an individual to becoming, hypothermic. That then becomes a secondary type of hypothermia.
So it's not far-fetched to be concerned, that vulnerable people are at risk of becoming hypothermic.
Not far-fetched
in these weather
at all,
conditions.
especially in this weather condition. Like you've highlighted earlier in your introduction, they're less fortunate. Those that don't have proper housing infrastructures, those that are sleeping under the bridges, and as I highlighted to earlier, those security guards, particularly in these cold weathers. And in the last couple of days, I must say, stress, it has been quite cold, and this individual can actually become hypothermic when exposed to these elements.
Yeah. What happens to the body during hypothermia?
Now, just to give a background, your body produces heat. Now, oftentimes, there's a biochemistry that happens, oxygen plus, glucose, heat is produced, carbon dioxide you breathe out. Now, what tends to happen during hypothermia, like I've highlighted earlier, the musculoskeletal, the liver, the brain and the heart, oftentimes these are the major organs that produces a lot of heat, and some of that is then carried through the rest of the body, through the circulatory system to warm up the rest of the body. So if you are now exposed to a cold weather for a prolonged period of time, or if you are submerged under cold water for a prolonged period of time, these organs kick in to try and produce as much heat to keep your internal body warm. The normal temperature is about 37.5. But then obviously with a prolonged exposure, the activities within these, organs comes down. And then you now start losing more heat than you're producing. And then once your temperature drops below 35, classically you then qualify to be an individual that is having hypothermia. Yeah.
Are there different stages of hypothermia, doctor?
Yeah, there are about 3 stages that we often use to classify hypothermia. Namely, first stage. The first stage really is just when you're shivering. And then, of course, your circulation sort of starts to slow down, where you have bradycardia. By that we mean your heart is beating a little bit lower than normal. And then if nothing is done, you then graduate into stage 2. Here you become a little bit irritable, you might be confused, you might be a little bit sleepy, lethargic. Your breathing and circulation is really now slowing down. And then obviously the advanced stage, unfortunately, this is where you might have slow, weak, or even absent pulses, and your breathing probably can also just stop, and then you can end into a respiratory failure or even a circulatory failure.
And is it treatable? What is the first aid for hypothermia?
Yeah, because like we have highlighted earlier, this individual can be confused and irritable. If you are now encountering an individual that is having hypothermia, you have to be gentle with them, reassure them. Cover them with a warm blanket if you're able to. Make sure that the floor on which their feet are or are seated is also insulated. If they are maybe hypothermic because they're in cold water, remove your cold clothes and cover them with a blanket that way. Give them some warm beverages, be it coffee, tea, or a cup of soup or something. And then, you know, talk to them and reassure them, check their breathing. And oftentimes when you have done that, that probably would have stabilized them. Then you can ferry them to the hospital where we come in, maybe putting up a drip, making sure we run in warm fluids, draw some blood, do blood gas, check their sugar, blood pressure, and then institutionalize them for 72 hours just to monitor and make sure that they're in a good space.
Fantastic. Yeah. Final remarks, Doctor?
All I want to say, really, this is probably a clarion call to just the corporate world out there. This time, you know, we see a lot of activities on social medias where people do winter drive. They go and hand out, you know, blankets, particularly to the less fortunate. Those that are in position to do so, this is probably the right time to do so and reach out to our less fortunate individuals. And for those that are running these security companies, try to, by all means, at least, you know, protect your employees. Make sure that when they are guarding those infrastructures, there's some proper, you know, rooms where they can sit in, you know, from time to time and warm up a little bit.
Doctor, thank you so much for being here once again.
It's always a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Nelson Makemba speaking to us this evening on the topic of hypothermia. We'll be right back shortly.